Hello boys and girls, here we are out in the field in Stivey, Causeway level crossing. I've got my very own cameraman with me today. Give us a thumbs up, Boyson. Uh-oh, shit's going down. Keep going, Boyson, keep rolling. Let's start this. Chapter 19. Sergeant Frisk was contemplating Reverend Bowen's cold, unsympathetic words as they approached the Causeway crossing. Reverend Bowen, motionless next to him, looked straight ahead. She was silent, making Frisk feel distinctly uneasy. The pounded meat in the crumpled carrier bag sat in her lap, warming in the hot police car. The coppery smell of bloody meat wafted up into Frisk's nostrils. His window was all the way down, as were all the other windows in the car, but the smell of the raw meat persisted. As they crested the incline onto the railway, Bowen and Frisk both turned their heads to look out of their respective windows. Bowen, to her left, looked west, seeing nothing but endless empty railway gleaming in the afternoon sunshine. Frisk looked out of his towards the east, towards the other level crossing and the bridge. Something caught his eye, or more accurately someone, positioned between the crossings. He didn't need to look twice to know who it was. "There he is," Frisk said, keeping his tone as neutral as possible in order not to alarm the vicar. He continued over the railway, descending the other side of the level crossing. "What? Where? Where is he, the little sod? Has he got Moses? Alan, why aren't you stopping?" Bowen asked in rapid bursts. "Well, it'd be rather stupid of me to stop on the railway line now, wouldn't it, Hilda?" he said as he pulled the car over to the other side of the road, a short distance from the railway. Down the causeway he could see Butch Ransom heading in their direction. He was with a female. Typical Butch, Frisk thought, before his mind snapped back into sharp focus at the sound of the level crossing's warning alarm, which you heard a minute ago. Reverend Bowen looked over her shoulder towards the railway. Her slippery, bloody, stained fingers grappled madly at her seatbelt. In the police car's rearview mirror, Frisk saw the flashing lights of the level crossing and watched grimly as the barriers descended. "Oh, perfect," he thought, switching off the engine and unfastening his seatbelt. Douglas shouted profane words of encouragement at the heavy goods train as it rumbled towards them. Moses still sat contentedly on the sleeper, nibbling the pizza. Douglas was lying flat on his belly, hoping the driver would not see him. Though the engine was still going too fast to stop entirely, it was better to remain hidden and let him pick up pace. Moses was unlikely to be spotted, not before it was too late anyway. Douglas looked at the docile dog between the railways, and a thought suddenly occurred to him. If Moses stayed where he was, then the train would surely just pass over him. In his current state, he didn't look like he was in the mood for much exertion. The dozy thing probably wouldn't even notice as the 100-ton engine and 20-odd petrol tankers rumbled over his little drunken head. Nope, he needed a change of plan. The ground began to rumble as the trundling goods train made steady progress towards the Stocks Lane crossing, and the rails began to hiss. Douglas lifted the pizza slice away from the dog. The animal's drunken, droopy eyes looked up in bleary confusion, lazily following it as Douglas drew it away. Moses sluggishly got to his feet, a little unsteadily, moving towards the outer rail that separated him from Douglas. The engine driver detected the movement on the tracks and at last began to sound his horn. The noise did not appear to bother Moses, though, who began munching away at the outstretched pizza once again. He settled down to continue his fist, only now his neck was resting on the warm, hissing rail. Da-da-da. Sergeant Frisk jogged towards the barriers. He was not quite as fit as he might have liked these days and was carrying a little extra weight as he approached 40, but he could still move when he wanted to, or in this case had to. Frisk ran up the incline towards the level crossing, hoping to jump the barrier in one smooth, graceful motion, like the professionals might have done back in the day. The problem was he was neither Bodie nor Doyle, and this wasn't London, it was Steventon. He swung his right leg at the barrier, hearing a tear as his trousers ripped open at the crotch. He slammed his palm against the barrier in frustration, fingering at the hole in the torn trousers. "Oh, great," he thought, "and clean on today as well." His other pair were sitting in the linen basket at home. "Bollocks," he said to himself before attempting to clear the barrier once more, clambering over it successfully, if a tad ungracefully on the second attempt. Frisk saw Dan Fowler standing on the signal box's top step. Fowler no doubt panicking at the sight of the police. Sergeant Frisk had already cautioned him for possession of marijuana and had warned him that any further use of illegal substances consumed on the job would be dealt with swiftly and his employers would have to be informed. "Keep them bloody barriers down, Dan," he said. The signalman's brow crumpled in confusion. "Steady on, Sarge, we've got one coming down the line," Fowler called out, looking perplexed as Frisk made his way onto the crossing. "What's the problem?" "That's the frigging problem," Frisk said, pointing towards Douglas and Moses and the diesel engine coming towards them. "Oof," Fowler said, with mild alarm, looking east. A figure in black lithely leapt the barriers, making Frisk's attempts look decidedly pathetic. It was Reverend Bowen, making her own dash onto the railway line. "You don't see this shit every day," Fowler said to himself as Bowen began to make up ground on the policeman. "Go on, Reverend," Fowler shouted from the top of the steps. Jesus, this was going to be close, Frisk thought as he stepped from the level crossing onto the crunching ballast of the railway embankment, his heart pounding hard in his chest. The ballast was banked up alongside the railway line, making for cumbersome running. He nearly fell as the ballast gave way on him and he slipped down on one knee. He decided that if he was going to make it to Douglas and Moses in time, he would have to run on the level ground of the railway line itself. Frisk switched over onto the line, carefully hitting every other sleeper as he closed the gap between himself, Douglas and the dog, running head-on towards the diesel engine that was growing in size ahead of him, fully concentrating on his footing. He didn't dare think what a slip could mean for him at this stage. He could hear the loud clacking flap of the engine and smell the fumes that spluttered from the diesel's roof. The ground was rumbling beneath his feet and the driver once again sounded the horn in futile alarm. Frisk could see that Douglas was waving at the engine, crouching down, waving with one hand and holding something out for the dog with the other. Frisk now saw with horror how Moses was positioned. His head was on the railway line and he was eating whatever it was that Douglas was holding out for him. Among the sensory maelstrom his mind was manically processing, Frisk detected movement, footsteps other than his own gaining on him from behind. He looked over his shoulder, startled to see Reverend Bowen running at full speed, her wild eyes fixed on Douglas. She was almost neck and neck with him. The look on her face sent a shiver down his spine. "You are in deep trouble, Douglas, my friend," he thought, looking from the vicar to Douglas, who was still waving at the engine. "I'll get the dog," he shouted over the sound of the blaring horn, the clacking diesel and the hissing rails. He didn't know if Bowen had heard him, though he needn't have worried. There was little doubt who the vicar had her sights set on. Douglas looked around, noticing at last that he had company. He did not run, however, merely started nodding his head as if mentally trying to spur the engine on, his head looking rapidly between the dog and the engine. The diesel engine was ginormous as it came upon him, but the adrenaline coursing through Frisk's body overcame his terror. In one final surge of momentum, he scooped Moses up off the railway line, seizing the dog like a scrum half would pick up a rugby ball at the back of a scrum. Kicking through the bamboo cane Douglas was holding and diving out of the engine's path with barely a second to spare. The engine's horn was ear-splittingly loud as the oily buffers flashed past his head only inches away. The dog lead screamed out from the plastic handle's housing as he tumbled down the verge and away from the railway line with Moses in his arms, like a fish taking a giant baited hook. The lead snagged and Frisk was jolted as the plastic handle pulled against the inside of the rail, only to tumble further a split second later as the lead was severed by the numerous steel wheels running over it. Frisk and Moses landed in a crumpled heap in a patch of stinging nettles at the bottom of the verge. He watched as the train thundered past, tanker after tanker rolling before him. Through the hole in his trousers a nettle stung his inner thigh and his forearms buzzed from the numerous other stings already inflicted on his exposed flesh. He hadn't seen what became of Douglas or Reverend Bowen after he'd grabbed Moses. Hadn't seen how Bowen had speared the squatting Douglas in a crunching tackle, splaying him out beside the railway line as the tankers clattered past dangerously close to them. Hadn't seen how she had tried to hold out Douglas's arm towards the clattering wheels in an attempt to dismember the limb of her dog's tormentor. Douglas only just strong enough to resist the deranged vicar's maniacal advances and regain possession of the bamboo cane that Frisk had earlier kicked out of his hand. He saw them now, though. They were both on their feet as the last of the tankers disappeared from view, and all he could hear now was the crunching of the ballast under his feet, the furious panting of both combatants, and the swishing, thwacking sound of the bamboo cane. Bowen had one hand around Douglas's throat, her other hand attempting to bat away the rapier-like blows of the cane that now peppered her arms, neck and face. Douglas's face was a mixture of terror and hysteria as he tried to beat his way free from the vicar's grip. The cane thwacked mercilessly one last time across the right-hand side of the vicar's face, and Douglas was free, Bowen releasing her grip and raising her hand to her cheek. Douglas tripped her, causing her to tumble backwards onto the ballast, not hesitating in seizing his opportunity to escape, running like hell from the vicar, but still having the presence of mind to flick the V's at Sergeant Frisk, who was stumbling out of the nettles and back up the verge with Moses, wincing from the pain of the stings and struggling to keep his balance. Reverend Bowen was sat up on her elbows beside the track, watching Douglas run off into the distance. She was breathing hard, and Frisk could already see the red welts from the cane beginning to form on her face. Panting heavily and in considerable discomfort, he made it back up the trackside with Moses. If he'd handed the dog back over 5 seconds earlier, it would have been Reverend Bowen that Moses would have vomited on. As it was the buzzing right forearm of Sergeant Frisk that suffered the further indignity at the hands of the drunken spaniel. He sighed, holding out the dog to the battle-weary Bowen. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Let's keep going. Chapter 20. We're nearly there, boys and girls. That was a close one. Sergeant Frisk and Reverend Bowen walked in silence back towards the level crossing, relieved that Moses was safe and back in the arms of his rightful owner, but dejected as the dog's tormentor had once again evaded capture. Dan Fowler, still at the top of the steps of the signal box, clapped the weary duo home. "Bloody hell, that was close, Sarge," he shouted. "Don't worry, I've radioed control and told them to halt all services in the area until further notice." Frisk raised his hand in recognition. "Thanks, Dan. Good work," he said, wiping his brow. "Let 'em up." Fowler did as he was instructed, ducking back in and raising the barriers, allowing the waiting traffic that had built up to cross at last. There were half a dozen cars, the drivers of which had all exited their vehicles, straining a look over the barriers to see what was going on further down the line. They now returned to their vehicles and continued on their way. Frisk had detected a cheeky smile and a little nod from Fowler to someone unseen before the signalman had gone back in to raise the barriers. He and Bowen stepped from the ballast of the railway track back onto the concrete of the level crossing, walking wearily back towards the police car. The sight that greeted them took them both entirely by surprise. Squirming in Butch Ransom's arms was a distinctly worried-looking Douglas Blouse. "Would you believe it, Sarge?" Butch called out with his usual jovial enthusiasm. "It just jumped into my arms." Frisk, tired from his exertions and irritated by the pain of his nettle stings, sighed with relief, even managing a little smile as he bent over, placing his hands on his knees. But underneath his relief, there was anger. Reverend Bowen, holding Moses, did not laugh, only stared into the eyes of the squirming boy who had brought so much havoc into her life. She softly stroked Moses, her hands covered in the dry blood of the pummeled steak that the dog now began to lick clean. "So," Frisk said, still a little breathless, "it's not just the women that throw themselves at you then, Butch?" "Phew! What about that then? Let's all get our breath back." End of part 1. And yeah, I think I'll leave that with you. Let's cut it, boyson. Ta-ta!